Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Computer Scientist. Tonight we're embarking on a gentle journey through the history of a remarkable little device that has quietly revolutionized the world of retro gaming. The r36s handheld console, a device so small it fits in your pocket, yet so significant it has reshaped how thousands of people experience gaming nostalgia. This is not a story of billion-dollar corporations or flashy marketing campaigns. Instead, it's a tale of open-source collaboration, budget-friendly innovation, and a community that rallied around an unlikely hero in the crowded landscape of handheld gaming devices. As you settle in for the night, let your mind drift back to late 2023. The world of retro handheld gaming was already bustling with options, from premium devices to budget alternatives, each promising to deliver that perfect blend of nostalgia and modern convenience. And then, almost quietly, the r36s arrived. Not with fanfare or grand announcements, but as one more entry in the endless stream of devices flooding marketplaces like AliExpress. Yet something about this particular handheld was different. Something that would make it stand out from the countless clones and variants that had come before it. Tonight, we'll explore every aspect of this device, from the silicon that powers it to the communities that embraced it, from its humble origins as an evolution of earlier designs, to its unexpected rise as one of the most beloved budget handhelds in the retro gaming space. We'll discover how a device that costs less than a nice dinner has brought joy to countless gamers, rekindling memories of childhood afternoons spent with Game Boys and PlayStations. We'll understand the technical decisions that shaped it, the open-source philosophy that defined it, and the grassroots movement that sustained it. But more than that, we'll understand what the r36s represents in the broader story of technology and gaming. It's a reminder that innovation doesn't always come from the biggest companies with the largest budgets. Sometimes it emerges from small manufacturers leveraging open-source designs, from communities sharing knowledge freely, and from people who simply want to make gaming accessible to everyone. The r36s is a democratization story, a tale of how technology becomes more inclusive when barriers are lowered and knowledge is shared. If you enjoy these calm explorations of technology and computing history, I invite you to like and subscribe or share a thought in the comments. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, just settle in. Let your breathing slow. Allow the gentle rhythm of this story to carry you toward rest. We have a wonderful journey ahead, but there's no hurry. The r36s waited years to tell its story. We can take our time discovering it. The year 2023 was drawing to a close when the r36s first appeared on the radar of retro gaming enthusiasts. To understand its significance, we need to step back slightly and appreciate the landscape it entered. The handheld emulation market had been growing steadily for years, driven by nostalgia for classic games and the technical capability to emulate older systems on increasingly affordable hardware. Companies like Anbernic and Powkiddy had established themselves as leaders in this space, offering devices that range from budget-friendly to premium, each targeting different segments of the market. But there was always room for something more accessible, something that could deliver a genuine retro gaming experience without demanding a significant financial commitment. Enter Game Console, a company that had been exploring this space with varying degrees of success. Game Console wasn't exactly a household name, even among retro gaming enthusiasts. They had gained some attention, and perhaps notoriety, for producing what many considered clones of existing devices. Their earlier effort, the r35s, was essentially a copy of Powkiddy's RGB20s, similar enough that Game Console was eventually barred from selling it on AliExpress. This rocky start might have discouraged other manufacturers, but it taught Game Console valuable lessons about what they could and couldn't do in this competitive market. The path from the R35s to the R36s involved more than just avoiding trademark issues. It required Game Console to understand what made a device truly appealing beyond simply copying someone else's homework. They needed to create something that was different enough to stand on its own, yet familiar enough to appeal to the same audience. They needed to tap into something deeper than just the hardware specifications listed on a product page. They needed to understand what retro gamers actually wanted when they held a device in their hands. What emerged was the R36s, released in late 2023. At first glance, it might have seemed like just another entry in an overcrowded market. A small vertical handheld with a 3.5-inch screen, sporting the familiar button layout that anyone who grew up with handheld gaming would recognize instantly. But several factors aligned to make the R36s special. Factors that would become clear only as the device found its audience and began building its reputation through word of mouth rather than marketing budgets. The first factor was the choice of processor. The R36s featured the Rockchip RK3326, a quad-core ARM Cortex-A35 CPU, capable of speeds up to 1.5 GHz, paired with a Mali G31 GPU. This wasn't cutting-edge technology by any means. The RK3326 had been around for a while, powering various devices in the budget handheld space. But that familiarity was actually a strength rather than a weakness. This chip was well understood by the community. Developers knew its capabilities and limitations. Custom firmware had already been optimized for it. This meant the R36s could benefit from years of accumulated knowledge and software refinement. The second factor was the design philosophy. Game Console had learned from their previous attempts. Rather than trying to innovate radically or create something dramatically different, they embraced a design that felt comfortingly familiar. The vertical form factor echoed the classic Game Boy, a shape that generations of gamers had held in their hands for countless hours. The button placement followed Nintendo's time-tested layout, a D-pad on the left, action buttons on the right, with shoulder buttons on the back. But Game Console added something that would prove crucial for certain games: dual analog sticks positioned below the main controls, reminiscent of PlayStation controllers. This design wasn't revolutionary, but it was thoughtful. The device measured approximately 82 by 130 millimeters and weighed just 187 grams, light enough to slip into a pocket without creating an uncomfortable bulge, compact enough to pull out during a commute or a quiet moment. The build quality was honest for the price point. This was not a premium device with glass and metal construction. It was plastic, utilitarian, functional. But the buttons had a satisfying click. The D-pad had good response, and the analog sticks, while small, were positioned well enough to be genuinely useful. The third factor, and perhaps the most important, was the screen. The R36 featured a 3.5-inch IPS display with a resolution of 640 by 480 pixels in a 4.3 aspect ratio. These specifications might sound modest in an era of high-definition displays and OLED screens, but they were nearly perfect for retro gaming. That 4:3 aspect ratio matched the original proportions of Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Super Nintendo, PlayStation 1, and many other classic systems. This meant games displayed without the black bars or stretching that plague devices with modern widescreen displays. The resolution was sharp enough to make pixelated sprites look crisp and intentional, rather than muddy or unclear. Game Console made an interesting choice with the screen technology. they used IPS or in-plane switching, which provided good viewing angles and decent color reproduction. The screen featured OCA full lamination, a technique that reduces the air gap between the display layers. This resulted in better clarity and reduced reflections, making the screen more pleasant to use in varied lighting conditions. For a budget device, this attention to display quality was notable. Many cheap handhelds cut corners on the screen, but Game Console understood that the display was the primary interface between player and game. A poor screen could ruin even the best hardware. The fourth factor was power management. The R36s included a battery rated at 3,500 mAh, though actual units sometimes shipped with slightly different capacities, usually around 3,000 to 200 mAh. This might not sound impressive compared to modern smartphones, but for a device primarily running relatively simple emulation software on efficient hardware, it translated to substantial playtime. Users reported getting anywhere from 4 to 8 hours of actual gameplay depending on the systems being emulated and screen brightness settings. This was enough for long gaming sessions without constantly worrying about finding a charger. The device charged via USB-C, a modern standard that meant users could charge it with the same cables they used for phones and other devices. The charging specifications called for a simple 5-volt, 1 to 2 amp adapter, nothing exotic or proprietary. A full charge took about 4 hours, reasonable for the battery capacity. The battery itself was removable, held in place with a standard connector, which meant users could potentially replace it if it degraded over time, or carry a spare for extended gaming sessions away from power sources. The fifth factor was connectivity and expandability. Here, the R36s made practical choices rather than trying to include every possible feature. The device did not include built-in Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, which might seem like significant omissions in 2023, but these choices helped keep the cost down while maintaining the focus on what the device did best: playing retro games. For users who wanted wireless connectivity, the USB-C port supported OTG or on-the-go functionality, meaning Wi-Fi dongles or Bluetooth adapters could be connected if desired. The device included a 3.5mm headphone jack, that increasingly rare feature that audiophiles and practical users alike appreciated. It meant using standard headphones without adapters, or worrying about battery-powered wireless earbuds dying mid-game. The built-in speaker was described as an 8-watt cavity speaker in some specifications, adequate for casual play, though most users opted for headphones when sound quality mattered. For storage, the R36s relied entirely on microSD cards. The device typically shipped with either 64 or 128GB cards preloaded with games, though the system could support cards up to 256GB or even larger. This expandable storage was crucial for a retro gaming device. ROM collections could grow large, and the ability to swap cards meant users could organize different gaming libraries or carry their entire collection on a spare card. The sixth factor, and one that would prove increasingly important, was the open source foundation. The R36s ran on a Linux-based operating system, specifically designed to be compatible with custom firmware developed by the community. The hardware design itself was based on openly available PCB layouts, meaning the device wasn't locked down by proprietary designs or firmware. This openness was both practical and philosophical. Practically, it meant the device could benefit from community-developed software improvements. Philosophically, it aligned with a movement in retro gaming toward open systems that users could control and modify. When the R36s first appeared on AliExpress and other marketplaces, it was priced aggressively. Initial listings showed prices around $50 to $60, though prices varied depending on storage capacity and seller. This pricing positioned it firmly in the budget category, costing roughly half what more established brands charged for similar capabilities. For many potential buyers, this low barrier to entry was transformative. It meant taking a chance on retro handheld gaming didn't require significant financial commitment. If the device didn't meet expectations, the loss was minimal. If it delivered on its promise, the value was extraordinary. But price alone doesn't create a successful product. The market was full of cheap handhelds that saved money by compromising quality to the point of being unpleasant to use. What began to set the R36s apart was that it didn't feel like a cheap device that happened to be inexpensive. It felt like a carefully considered device that had been designed with a clear understanding of what retro gamers wanted and what corners could be cut without compromising the experience. To understand the R36s fully, we need to venture inside the plastic shell and examine the technical decisions that shaped its capabilities and limitations. At the center of everything sits the Rockchip RK3326 system-on-chip, a piece of silicon that would prove both enabling and constraining for the device's ambitions. The RK3326 was not designed specifically for handheld gaming devices. Rockchip, a Chinese semiconductor company, created it as a general-purpose processor for portable devices, including media players, basic tablets, and yes, gaming handhelds. The chip featured 4 ARM Cortex-A35 CPU cores arranged in a cluster, capable of running at speeds up to 1.5 GHz. The Cortex-A35 was ARM's energy-efficient architecture, designed to provide reasonable performance while sipping power rather than gulping it. Alongside the CPU cores, the RK3326 integrated a Mali G31 MP2 GPU. This graphics processor was designed for efficiency rather than raw power. It featured 2 execution cores and supported OpenGL ES 3.2, Vulkan 1.0, and OpenCL 2.0, providing the necessary graphics APIs for running emulators efficiently. The Mali G31 wasn't going to run modern 3D games or handle complex shader effects, but for rendering the sprites and polygons of retro games, it was more than adequate. The memory subsystem consisted of 1 GB of LPDDR3 RAM. This might seem paltry compared to modern devices sporting 8, 12, or even 16 GB, but remember the context. The games being emulated were designed for systems that had measured their RAM in kilobytes, or at most a few dozen megabytes. Even accounting for the overhead of running a Linux operating system and emulation software, 1 GB provided comfortable headroom for nearly everything the R36s was designed to do. The RK3326 also integrated various peripheral controllers, the display controller that drove the screen, USB controllers for the Type-C port, audio codecs for the speaker and headphone jack, and power management circuits that handled battery charging and voltage regulation. This integration was crucial for keeping costs down and power consumption reasonable. Each component that didn't need to be a separate chip reduced both the bill of materials and the complexity of the circuit board. From an emulation perspective, the RK3326's capabilities mapped interestingly onto the history of gaming consoles. For 8-bit systems like the Nintendo Entertainment System, Game Boy, and Sega Master System, the chip was massively overpowered. These games ran flawlessly, often allowing for additional features like save states, fast forward, and visual filters without impacting performance. The same held true for 16-bit era systems, Super Nintendo, Genesis, Game Boy Advance. These ran beautifully, with virtually perfect compatibility and the ability to enhance games with features the original hardware never offered. Where things became interesting was with 32-bit and early 3D systems. The original PlayStation or PS1 was arguably the showcase system for devices in the r36s's performance class. The vast PS1 library, filled with genre-defining classics, ran remarkably well on the r36s. Most games achieved full speed with accurate emulation, though a few particularly demanding titles might show occasional slowdowns. This PES compatibility was crucial for the r36s's appeal. The PlayStation library represented a golden age for many gamers, and being able to carry those experiences in a pocket-sized device was transformative. The Nintendo 64 presented a more mixed picture. Nintendo's 3D console from the mid-90s had a relatively small but beloved game library. The RK3326 could handle many N64 titles, though performance varied significantly. Simpler games or those with efficient rendering ran well. More complex titles, or those that push the original hardware, might struggle, requiring frame skip or reduced accuracy settings to maintain playable speeds. This variability meant that N64 support on the R36s was best described as hit or miss, rather than universally strong. The Sega Dreamcast, despite being roughly contemporary with the N64, was generally too demanding for the R36s. While some simpler Dreamcast titles could run at reduced settings, the system was largely beyond the device's capabilities. The same applied to PlayStation Portable. Though the PSP was the same generation as the PS2 in terms of release timing, its architecture and game demands generally exceeded what the RK3326 could handle comfortably. Some PSP games could run, particularly simpler 2D titles or very well-optimized 3D games, but expecting full PSP compatibility would be unrealistic. Arcade emulation presented its own complexities. The variety of arcade hardware over the decades meant that arcade emulation wasn't a single target, but hundreds of different systems. The R36s handled earlier arcade games quite well, from classics like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong through the sprite-scaling wonders of the late 80s and early 90s. More demanding arcade boards, particularly those from the mid to late 90s with 3D graphics, were generally too much for the device. The screen technology deserves closer examination. That 3.5-inch IPS panel was the primary window into all these emulated worlds, and its characteristics significantly shape the user experience. The 640 by 480 resolution, while modest by modern standards, was actually well chosen for retro gaming. Consider that the original Game Boy Advance had a resolution of 240 by 160 pixels. Displayed on the R36s's screen, GBA games could be scaled up using integer multiples, where each pixel in the original image mapped to a neat 2x2 or 3x3 block of pixels on the display. This integer scaling prevented the blurriness or shimmering that can occur with non-integer scaling ratios. The 4:3 aspect ratio similarly aligned with the original displays these games were designed for. Many classic consoles output to CRT televisions with this same aspect ratio. Displaying these games on modern widescreen displays often requires either stretching the image, which distorts the carefully crafted sprite work and level design, or adding black bars to the sides to maintain the correct proportions. The R36s's screen eliminated this compromise, presenting games in their intended format by default. The IPS technology provided viewing angles that were more than adequate for a handheld device. Unlike older TN or twisted pneumatic, panels that would show color shifts and contrast loss when viewed from angles, the IPS screen maintained consistent image quality, whether held directly in front of the face or at more casual angles. For a device that might be played while lying in bed, sitting on a couch, or standing on a bus, this viewing angle tolerance was valuable. The OCA, or optically clear adhesive lamination reduced the air gap between the display layers. In older or cheaper devices, this air gap could create parallax effects where the image appeared to float below the surface of the glass, and it could create annoying reflections of internal components. The OCA lamination bonded the layers more tightly, improving clarity and reducing these artifacts. For a budget device, this was a quality touch that suggested Game Console was thinking about the actual user experience rather than just hitting a price point. However, the R36s screen story had a complication that would become a significant subplot in the device's history: screen variability. Game Console didn't manufacture all the R36s units themselves. The device's open-source hardware design meant multiple factories could produce units, and different manufacturers sourced components from different suppliers. This led to at least 5, possibly more, distinct screen panels being used across various production runs. These screens, while all nominally 3.5-inch IPS displays with 640 by 480 resolution, had different firmware requirements and slightly different characteristics. This variability would create headaches for custom firmware developers who had to account for these different screens in their software. It would also occasionally cause frustration for users who received devices that didn't work properly with standard firmware images and had to troubleshoot which screen variant they had. We'll explore this challenge more deeply when we discuss the software ecosystem, but it's worth noting here as one of the trade-offs of the R36s's low cost and open design. The physical design of the R36s reflected thoughtful ergonomic decisions within the constraints of its compact size. The vertical form factor placed the screen above the controls, creating a layout that felt natural to anyone who had held a Game Boy or Game Boy Advance. The device's width accommodated the screen while leaving enough space on either side for the D-pad and action buttons, without crowding them together uncomfortably. The D-pad followed Nintendo's cross design, with the 4 directions forming a plus shape that allowed for precise directional input. The quality of a D-pad can make or break a retro gaming device, since so many classic games relied on precise directional control. The R36s's D-pad generally received positive marks from users. It wasn't as refined as Nintendo's own hardware, but it was responsive and accurate enough for everything from platformers to fighting games. The 4 action buttons on the right side followed the familiar A, B, X, Y layout, though their physical arrangement and labeling varied slightly between different production runs. These buttons had a satisfying travel and click, not mushy or vague, but with enough tactile feedback to confirm each press. The slightly rubberized texture mentioned in some reviews helped prevent fingers from slipping during extended play sessions, particularly useful during intense gaming moments when hands might perspire slightly. Below the main controls sat the dual analog sticks, and these were one of the R36s's standout features in its price class. Many budget handhelds either omitted analog controls entirely or provided a single stick. The R36 offered 2, positioned where thumbs could naturally reach them after leaving the main buttons. These weren't full-sized analog sticks like those found on modern gamepads. They were smaller, lower-profile designs, but they were genuinely analog, providing smooth graduated input rather than just acting as digital 8-way controls. The inclusion of dual analog sticks expanded the R36's capabilities. For systems that originally used analog controls, particularly PlayStation games, this meant more authentic gameplay. Driving games felt more natural with analog steering. 3D platformers with camera controls worked as intended. First-person elements in games could be navigated smoothly. The sticks weren't perfect. Their small size and limited throw meant they couldn't match the precision of full-sized controls, but their presence and generally good quality elevated the R36s above many competitors. On the device's shoulders sat 4 trigger buttons: L1, L2, R1, and R2. These followed the PlayStation convention of offering 2 triggers per side, important for accurately emulating games that used these controls. The triggers were well positioned, accessible without stretching fingers uncomfortably, and provided good tactile feedback described by users as mouse-like clicks. This firm, definite response was preferable to vague or mushy triggers that left players uncertain whether they had actually pressed the button. The front face of the device included additional buttons for select, start, and a home button for accessing system menus. These were smaller than the main controls, placed between the screen and the main buttons, positioned to be accessible but not easily pressed accidentally during gameplay. The power button and volume rocker were typically located on the top or side edge of the device, again positioned to be accessible without being vulnerable to accidental activation. The back of the R36s was relatively plain, with a smooth contour that fit comfortably in the hands. Some users noted that the device could benefit from slightly more aggressive texturing or grips on the back to prevent slipping, but the lightweight design meant that grip security was less critical than it would be for a heavier device. The battery compartment door was usually secured with small screws, a design choice that prevented accidental opening but required a screwdriver for battery replacement. The USB-C port on the bottom edge handled both charging and data transfer. This modern standard was appreciated by users who had moved away from micro USB cables and appreciated not needing yet another cable type. The port's position on the bottom meant it could be charged while playing if using a short cable, though the cable would need to route away from the player's hands. The headphone jack, typically positioned on the top edge or near the USB-C port, meant users could comfortably use wired headphones without cables crossing awkwardly in front of the screen. The microSD card slot's position varied across different production runs, sometimes on the bottom edge, sometimes on the side. This slot was crucial since the device relied entirely on removable storage. The lack of internal storage beyond what was needed for the operating system meant users had complete control over their game library, easily swapping cards to access different collections or upgrading to larger capacities as their libraries grew. The speaker grille, usually positioned on the bottom edge, housed that 8-watt cavity speaker. The audio quality from the built-in speaker was functional rather than impressive. As with most small handheld devices, the physics of tiny speakers meant that audio couldn't match dedicated headphones or external speakers. The sound was clear enough for casual play, adequate for sound effects and music, but lacked the depth and richness that audio enthusiasts would want. For serious play, particularly with games known for excellent soundtracks, the headphone jack was the better option. The overall build quality struck a balance appropriate for the price point. This was not a premium device with metal frames or glass panels. The plastic construction was honest about what it was, a budget device designed to be affordable and functional. However, within those constraints, the R36s felt solid enough. It didn't creak or flex alarmingly when held. The buttons and controls didn't feel cheap or likely to fail after minimal use. It was a device that acknowledged its place in the market while trying to provide the best experience possible within that position. The hardware of the R36s was only half the story. What truly elevated the device from another budget handheld to something special was the software ecosystem that developed around it. This ecosystem was built on foundations of open-source philosophy, community collaboration, and years of development work that predated the R36s itself. When the R36 are shipped from various manufacturers, it typically came with a stock firmware installation. This stock software was functional but basic, providing access to the preloaded games through a simple menu system. The firmware was generally based on modifications of Emulec, an open-source retro gaming distribution designed for embedded devices. However, the stock firmware often had rough edges. The interface might be clunky, features limited, and performance not fully optimized. For many users, the stock firmware was merely a starting point, something to try out the device before inevitably moving to custom firmware developed by the community. The true power of the r36s emerged through custom firmware, particularly ArkOS. ArkOS was not created specifically for the r36s. It had a longer history, developed originally for the Ambernic RG351 series and other devices based on the RK3326 chipset. The developers behind ArkOS, particularly user Aeolus UX and the broader community, had refined the software over years, optimizing performance, adding features, and creating an interface that balanced functionality with usability. When the r36s appeared with its RK3326 processor and standard hardware design, it was naturally compatible with ArkOS. However, that screen variability we discussed earlier created complications. Different r36s units with different screen panels required different device tree blobs, or DTBs, which told the software how to communicate with the specific hardware components. The ArkOS community responded by creating what they called Panel Picker Mode, a boot sequence that allowed users to select which screen type their device had, ensuring compatibility across the various hardware revisions. Installing ArkOS transformed the r36s experience. The interface was cleaner, more polished, and more responsive than the stock firmware. The system organized games by console, with each emulator properly configured and optimized for the RK3326's capabilities. Users could customize the appearance with themes, adjust performance settings for individual games, and access advanced features like NetPlay for multiplayer gaming over network connections, assuming users had added Wi-Fi dongles. ArkOS included RetroArch as its primary emulation platform. RetroArch is a monumental open-source project that provides a unified interface for dozens of different emulators, called cores in RetroArch terminology. Instead of managing separate applications for each console, RetroArch created a consistent experience where users could access any supported system through the same interface, apply the same visual filters, use the same save state system, and configure controls once rather than repeatedly. The emulator cores available through ArkOS on the r36s covered an impressive range of systems. For Nintendo platforms, NS through the FCM or Nestopia cores, SNES through SNES 9X, N64 through MUP N64 Plus or Parallel, Game Boy and Game Boy Color through Gambat or Sameboy, Game Boy Advance through MGBA or VBA Next, and Nintendo DS through Drastic or Melon DS. For Sega systems, Master System, Genesis, Game Gear, Saturn, and Dreamcast all had dedicated cores with varying levels of performance depending on the demands of the emulated system. For PlayStation, the PCSX rearmed core provided excellent PS1 emulation. This core was specifically optimized for ARM processors like the one in the r36s, providing better performance than the standard PCSX core. For PSP, the PPSS-PP core was available, though as mentioned earlier, PSP emulation pushed the limits of what the RK3326 could handle. Arcade emulation came through multiple cores, MAME for general arcade machine emulation, Final Burn Neo for various arcade boards, and specialized cores for specific arcade hardware. Beyond RetroArch, ArkOS included standalone emulators for systems that benefited from dedicated applications. Drastic for Nintendo DS provided better performance than the RetroArch core in many cases. ScumVM allowed playing classic point-and-click adventure games. Pico 8 support enabled running games made for that fantasy console. The software package was comprehensive, covering virtually every retro gaming need up through the early 2000s. But ArkOS wasn't the only custom firmware option. Rocknix, formerly known as Gelos, provided an alternative distribution with its own approach to the user interface and system management. Rocknix was based on EmuElec but heavily modified, focusing on performance optimization and ease of use. Some users preferred its simplified interface, while others appreciated ArkOS's more extensive customization options. The existence of multiple quality firmware options meant users could choose based on personal preference, and the community could learn from each project's innovations. Other firmware options included AmberElec, another EmuElec derivative focused on the ArkOS platform, Lacquer, a distribution built on RetroArch that provided a PlayStation 3-style XMB interface, and even experimental ports of other systems. The availability of these options reflected both the open-source nature of the r36s platform and the active, engaged community that had formed around these devices. Updating the firmware on an r36s required some technical comfort, but wasn't overly complex. The process typically involved downloading the firmware image, writing it to a microSD card using software like Balena Etcher or Win32Disk Mega, then booting the r36s from that card. The device would load the new firmware, and users could then add their own game ROMs to the appropriate folders on the SD card. For users accustomed to devices that updated through simple download and install processes, this might seem involved, but the retro handheld community generally embraced this level of engagement with their devices. The custom firmware community developed extensive documentation, guides, and troubleshooting resources. The r36s wiki on handhelds. Wiki became an essential resource, providing information about hardware variants, firmware installation steps, compatibility lists for different games, recommended settings, and solutions to common problems. Community forums on Reddit, particularly the r36s subreddit, became gathering places where users shared tips, solved problems, and celebrated their gaming experiences. One particularly valuable community contribution was the game compatibility lists. Given the wide range of systems the r36s could theoretically emulate, knowing which specific games ran well and which struggled was invaluable. Users like Batu compiled extensive lists testing hundreds or thousands of games across multiple platforms, noting which games ran at full speed, which needed adjustments, and which were simply too demanding. These lists saved countless hours of trial and error for other users. The software ecosystem also included aesthetic customization. Emulation Station, the front-end interface used by ArkOS and similar firmware, supported themes that could completely change the look and feel of the system. Some themes emphasized nostalgia with retro-inspired designs. Others provided modern minimalist interfaces. Still others created elaborate visual presentations with animated backgrounds and custom artwork. The community shared these themes freely, and creating custom themes became a hobby within the hobby of retro gaming. Boot logos and loading screens could also be customized. Users created splash screens featuring their favorite games, characters, or artistic designs. While these customizations didn't affect functionality, they personalized the device, making each r36s unique to its owner. This personalization fostered a sense of ownership and connection with the device that went beyond simply using a commercial product. The software's capability to save and load states at any point in any game fundamentally changed how retro games could be experienced. Original hardware required reaching save points or completing entire levels in one session. The R36s, through its emulation software, allowed saving at any moment, effectively creating checkpoints wherever desired. This made challenging games more approachable, allowed playing in shorter sessions without losing progress, and enabled experimentation without consequence. Similarly, the fast-forward function changed game pacing. Grinding in RPGs, watching lengthy animations, or traversing slow sections could be accelerated, respecting players' time and removing tedium. For games with unskippable cutscenes or slow text crawl, this feature was transformative. Original games were sometimes constrained by design decisions that made sense in their era, but felt unnecessarily time-consuming decades later. Emulation features allowed respecting the game design while accommodating modern sensibilities. The software also enabled visual enhancements that could improve or change the appearance of retro games. Shaders and filters could replicate the look of old CRT televisions, complete with scan lines, phosphor glow, and curvature. For players who associated these visual characteristics with their nostalgic memories, these filters enhanced authenticity. For others, the sharp pixels of native digital output provided clarity that CRTs never achieved. The ability to choose meant each player could experience games in the way that felt most correct to them. NetPlay functionality, available when users added Wi-Fi capabilities, opened possibilities for multiplayer gaming across distances. Games that originally required gathering friends around a single screen could now be played with people anywhere in the world. This breathed new life into competitive classics and cooperative adventures, creating new social experiences around decades-old games. The achievement system integration through retro achievements added modern gaming metastructures to retro titles. This community project had created achievement sets for thousands of classic games, defining challenges and milestones that weren't part of the original games. Players could compare progress, compete for completions, and find new ways to engage with games they had played countless times. For some users, this added a compelling reason to revisit old favourites or explore overlooked titles. The software's active development meant the R36s improved over time, even for users who didn't upgrade their hardware. Regular firmware updates brought performance optimizations, bug fixes, new features, and expanded compatibility. A device purchased in late 2023 could feel noticeably better by mid-2024, simply through software improvements. This longevity contrasted with commercial products that often received minimal updates after launch. However, the software ecosystem wasn't without challenges. The screen variability we mentioned created ongoing complications. New users sometimes struggled to get their devices working properly because they didn't realize they needed specific configurations for their screen panel. The community developed tools to identify screen types and automated processes to select the correct files. But this remained a point of friction that didn't exist with more tightly controlled commercial products. ROMs, the actual game files, represented another complex issue. While the R36s shipped with thousands of preloaded games, these ROM sets were often incomplete, incorrectly labeled, or poor quality dumps. Serious users typically replaced these with properly verified ROM sets from reputable sources. However, the legal status of game ROMs remained murky. Emulation itself was legal, and owning backup copies of games you owned physically was generally considered fair use. But downloading ROMs from internet sources existed in a legal grey area that most users navigated pragmatically rather than with strict legal correctness. The software's power and flexibility came with a learning curve. Users coming from simple commercial devices or modern consoles where everything was designed to be instantly intuitive sometimes found the r36s ecosystem overwhelming. The need to potentially flash firmware, organize ROM files in specific directory structures, configure emulator settings, and troubleshoot compatibility issues required a level of engagement that not everyone wanted from a gaming device. However, for those who enjoyed this aspect of the hobby, the tinkering itself became part of the appeal. Documentation and community support mitigated these challenges considerably. The aforementioned wikis and forums provided answers to nearly every question. Video tutorials on YouTube walked through every process step by step. Community members on Reddit and Discord channels responded to questions with patience and detailed guidance. This support network transformed what could have been a frustrating experience into a journey of learning and discovery. With the hardware and software landscape established, we can now explore what it was actually like to play games on the r36s. This was, after all, the point of the device. All the technical specifications and community developments were in service of one goal: enabling people to play and enjoy classic games in a convenient portable form. The moment of first turning on an r36s and navigating to a beloved game from childhood held a particular magic. Seeing that familiar title screen appear on the small IPS display, hearing those remembered chiptunes from the small speaker or through headphones, and feeling the weight of the device in hands as fingers found their familiar positions on the controls, this sequence of experiences connected decades of gaming history. The games themselves were identical to the ones played in childhood, but the context was transformed. That living room television or Game Boy held in a car became this pocket-sized device that could be pulled out anywhere, anytime. For Nintendo Entertainment System games, the r36s was revelatory in its surplus of capability. These games, running on hardware from the mid-80s, were so far below the r36s's processing power that emulation was essentially perfect. Super Mario Bros. Loaded instantly. The platforming felt exactly as it should, with zero input latency and frame-perfect responsiveness. The Legend of Zelda's sprawling overworld could be explored with save states, allowing experimentation without the fear of losing progress. Mega Man's challenging action felt just as difficult but more approachable with the ability to save before each boss attempt. The NES's vast library, hundreds upon hundreds of games across every genre imaginable, became accessible in one device. Hidden gems that might never have been discovered in childhood because the local rental store didn't carry them could now be explored. International releases that never made it to certain regions were suddenly available. Fan translations of Japanese exclusive titles opened entire categories of games that would have required importing expensive cartridges and modded consoles in earlier eras. Super Nintendo emulation was similarly excellent. The SNES's more sophisticated graphics, with its Mode 7 rotation and scaling effects, transparent layers, and larger sprites, all rendered perfectly on the r36s. Super Mario World's vibrant worlds, The Legend of Zelda. A Link to the Past's sprawling adventure, Super Metroid's atmospheric exploration, and Chrono Trigger's epic time-traveling story all played flawlessly. The SNES library was arguably one of gaming's golden ages, and having reliable access to these games in a portable format felt like carrying a piece of gaming history. The ability to use save states fundamentally changed how SNES RPGs could be experienced. Games like Final Fantasy VI or Earthbound, with their lengthy playtimes and traditional save point systems, could now be played in shorter bursts. The modern gamer, with less uninterrupted time than childhood afternoons, could experience these classics without requiring multi-hour sessions. The games remained as engaging as ever, but the barrier to entry lowered significantly. Game Boy and Game Boy Color emulation hit a particular note of nostalgia. These were systems designed for handheld play, and experiencing them on a modern handheld created an interesting echo. The original Game Boy's monochrome display became vibrant color on the r36s's screen. Game Boy Color's limited but charming palette expanded to full RGB reproduction. The games themselves, designed for 4-direction D-pad control and 2 buttons, felt perfectly suited to the r36's controls. Pokémon games, which defined portable gaming for many millennials, were perhaps the quintessential Game Boy experience on the r36. The ability to catch them all, to trade between different ROM files through emulator features, and to use save states to capture legendary Pokémon or win slots at the game corner added new dimensions to these beloved games. For many users, reliving the Pokémon journey was one of their first experiences with the r36s, a perfect introduction to what the device could do. Game Boy Advance emulation was where the r36s started showing its optimization. The GBA was a more powerful system than its predecessors, with a 32-bit processor and significantly more capable graphics. The r36s handled GBA games beautifully, maintaining full speed while rendering the system's colourful sprites and backgrounds. The GBA library included some of the finest 2D games ever created, from Metroid Fusion's tense exploration to Advance War's deep tactical gameplay, and the r36s presented them wonderfully. The screen's 640 by 480 resolution was particularly well suited for GBA games. The GBA's native 240 by 160 resolution could be scaled by exactly 2 or 3 times, resulting in crisp, clean pixels without the blur of non-integer scaling. Many users considered the r36s screen superior to the original GBA's screen, which, while innovative for a backlit handheld, lacked the vibrancy and viewing angles of modern IPS technology. Sega Genesis emulation was another strength. Sonic's speed-based platforming, Streets of Rage's beat-em-up action, and Phantasy Star's RPG adventuring all ran perfectly. The Genesis library, sometimes overshadowed by Nintendo's offerings, included numerous classics and hidden gems that deserved rediscovery. The r36s made that rediscovery accessible, with the entire 16-bit Sega experience in a pocket-friendly package. PlayStation 1 emulation was the r36s's showcase platform, the system that really demonstrated what the device could do within its capabilities. The PS1 library was enormous, varied, and included genre-defining games that shaped modern gaming. Final Fantasy VII, Vrain, and Dice brought epic stories and complex battle systems. Metal Gear Solid offered cinematic stealth action. Crash Bandicoot and Spyro provided colourful 3D platforming. Resident Evil brought survival horror. Gran Turismo simulated realistic racing. Tony Hawk revolutionized skateboarding games. The list went on and on. The r36s made these experiences portable in ways that even the original PSP couldn't fully achieve. While the PSP had excellent PS1 compatibility, its game library required purchasing digital versions or carrying UMDs. The r36s, through emulation, could access the entire PS1 library immediately. The dual analog sticks, while not identical to the PlayStation controller, were positioned well enough to provide genuine dual-stick control for games that supported it. Performance across the PS1 library was generally excellent. Most games ran at full speed with accurate emulation. Some particularly demanding titles or effects might cause occasional slowdowns, but these were rare enough that they didn't significantly impact the experience. The community-maintained compatibility list helped users know what to expect, but generally if a game was released for PS1, it probably ran well on the r36s. Nintendo 64 emulation was where the r36s's limitations became more apparent. N64 emulation is inherently challenging even on powerful hardware due to the system's unusual architecture and the way many games were programmed. The R36 could handle many N64 titles, but performance was inconsistent. Games like Super Mario 64, often considered a benchmark for emulation, ran well with appropriate settings. Other titles might require reduced resolution, frame skipping, or accuracy compromises to maintain playable speeds. The N64's smaller library compared to PlayStation meant that incompatibility with some titles was less devastating to the overall experience. Most users identified a subset of N64 games that ran acceptably on the R36s and focused on those, accepting that the full library wasn't accessible. Games like Mario Kart 64, The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Super Smash Bros. And Star Fox 64 generally worked, giving access to some of Nintendo's most important 3D classics. Arcade emulation opened up a world that was previously difficult to access outside of actual arcade machines or expensive arcade stick setups. The R36s could run thousands of arcade games from the golden age of the arcades through the mid-90s. Street Fighter II, with all its variants, could be played with surprisingly good control considering the handheld format. Classic shoot-'em-ups, or shmups, from games like 1942 to more elaborate bullet hell titles, found a natural home on the vertical screen. Arcade platformers, puzzle games, and beat-'em-ups all became accessible. The portability of these arcade experiences was particularly meaningful. Arcade games were designed for quarter-munching difficulty, expecting players to fail repeatedly and feed more coins into the machine. The R36s's save states and infinite continues transformed these experiences, making genuinely difficult games approachable for players who wanted to experience the games without the original arcade economics. For purists, the option to play without these modern conveniences preserved the authentic challenge. The battery life during actual gameplay varied based on what was being emulated and how the screen brightness was configured. Simple 8-bit and 16-bit games, which didn't heavily load the processor or GPU, might allow 6 to 8 hours of continuous play. More demanding systems like PS1 or arcade games with complex graphics might reduce that to 4 to 6 hours. N64 or other processor-intensive systems could drop battery life further. These estimates varied between users based on their specific configurations and usage patterns, but generally the R36s provided enough battery life for substantial gaming sessions. The portability factor cannot be overstated. The ability to slip the R36 into a jacket pocket, pull it out during a commute, and play for 20 minutes, then return it to the pocket without worrying about closing games or losing progress, fundamentally changed how retro games could fit into modern life. These games were designed for an era when gaming required dedicated time and attention. The R36s's save states and portability made them compatible with the life of interrupted moments and stolen minutes. The headphone experience enhanced longer gaming sessions. The built-in speaker was adequate for casual play, but many retro games featured memorable soundtracks that deserved to be heard properly. With decent headphones, the chiptune compositions of the 8-bit era took on new depth. The synthesized orchestras of the 16-bit generation sounded richer. The Red Book audio of PlayStation CD soundtracks played with clarity. The audio experience became an important part of the overall package. The control feel, that intangible quality of how responsive and accurate the inputs felt, generally satisfied users. The D-pad handled 2D games well, with good diagonal recognition and minimal accidental inputs. The action buttons responded crisply. The analog sticks, while small, provided smooth, gradual input. The shoulder buttons clicked satisfyingly. No single element was best in class, but the combined package worked well enough that controls rarely became a frustration or limitation. The screen's 4.3 aspect ratio meant games appeared in their original proportions without stretching or letterboxing. This might seem like a small detail, but it preserved the artistic intent of the games. Sprite work was carefully designed for specific screen dimensions. Level layouts were crafted with particular aspect ratios in mind. Preserving these relationships meant games looked and felt as their creators intended. The overall gaming experience on the R36s was characterized by accessibility and nostalgia, balanced with modern convenience. These were the same games that many users had played decades earlier, but freed from the limitations of original hardware. No longer needed were dozens of cartridges or discs, console-specific controllers and television setups. Everything was contained in one small device that could go anywhere, be played any time, and preserved progress indefinitely through save states and battery backup. The story of the R36s hardware is complicated by something unusual in consumer electronics. Nobody really knows exactly who makes it, or more accurately, many different entities make versions of it. This manufacturing ambiguity stems from the device's open-source hardware design and the structure of electronics manufacturing in China, where the R36s originates. The R36s was built around an openly available PCB design. This meant that the circuit board layout, component placement, and technical specifications were not proprietary secrets, but shared information that any factory with the right capabilities could use. This approach had advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was it enabled competitive pricing through multiple manufacturers and prevented any single company from controlling supply or prices. The disadvantage was it created variations, quality inconsistencies, and confusion about what exactly constituted an authentic R36s. Game console, the name most commonly associated with the R36s, appears to be more of a brand name than a single manufacturing entity. Various sellers on platforms like AliExpress operated under this branding, but whether they all sourced from the same factory or represented different operations using the same PCB design remains unclear. This ambiguity extended to the components used. Different production runs might use different brands of capacitors, slightly different plastic formulations for the shell, or, most significantly, different display panels. The screen panel variation became the most visible manifestation of this manufacturing diversity. As mentioned earlier, at least 5 distinct screen types appeared across different R36s units. These weren't dramatically different in user-visible specifications. They were all approximately 3.5-inch IPS panels with 640 by 480 resolution, but they used different controller chips and required different initialization sequences, which meant they needed different device tree configurations in the firmware. This screen situation created one of the R36 community's most persistent challenges. A user would purchase an R36, attempt to install custom firmware following standard instructions, and be met with a black screen. The device wasn't broken. It simply had a screen variant that required different configuration files. The community's solution, that panel picker mode that allowed selecting the correct screen type during boot, worked well once users knew about it, but many new purchasers experienced initial frustration before discovering this solution. Some sellers became known as more reliable sources. On AliExpress, stores like Zeo1 Ali Choice Store, Boy Home Store, and Factory Game Direct Store developed reputations for consistent quality and responsive customer service. These sellers didn't necessarily manufacture the devices themselves, but they maintained quality control standards and handled customer issues professionally. Recommendations within the community often pointed new buyers toward these established sellers to minimize the chances of receiving problematic units or encountering unresponsive support. The packaging and presentation of the R36s varied wildly between sellers and production batches. Some units arrived in elaborate retail boxes with colorful graphics and multilingual instructions. Others came in plain brown boxes with minimal labeling. Some included screen protectors and cleaning cloths. Others provided just the device, a USB cable, and perhaps a brief instruction sheet. This variation didn't affect functionality, but it contributed to the sense that R36s units from different sources might be quite different products despite carrying the same name. The included game library showed similar variation. While all units shipped with preloaded ROM sets, the specific games, organization, and quality of these sets differed significantly. Some sellers curated relatively clean libraries with properly labeled games and functional box art. Others included massive, messy collections filled with duplicates, incorrectly labeled titles, and poor quality dumps. Some users reported receiving 64 GB cards advertised as containing 15,000 games, which, given typical ROM sizes for older systems, seemed plausible if the collection included multiple versions of games and possibly some questionable additions. The actual storage capacity of included SD cards sometimes didn't match advertised specifications. A card marked as 128 GB might actually provide significantly less usable space. This practice, unfortunately common with cheap storage media, meant users interested in maintaining large game libraries often replaced the included cards with known quality alternatives from reputable brands. This replacement also gave users control over organizing their libraries according to their preferences rather than dealing with the preloaded organization. Quality control varied across manufacturers and batches. Most users received units that worked well, with properly seated components, functional buttons and screens without dead pixels. However, some reported issues: buttons that stuck or felt mushy, screens with color banding or backlight bleeding, batteries that didn't hold charge as long as specified, or casings that fit together poorly, with visible gaps or misalignments. The budget nature of the device meant some manufacturing variation was expected, but the open-source hardware landscape made it less clear who to contact when issues arose. Return and warranty policies depended entirely on the specific seller. Some offered 30-day returns and responsive problem resolution. Others were less accommodating once a sale was completed. This variability meant buyer research was important. Reading reviews of specific sellers, checking their response to customer complaints, and understanding the return policy before purchasing could save significant frustration if issues arose. The R36s community forums often included discussions of seller reliability, providing informal quality ratings based on collective experience. The evolution of hardware revisions added another layer of complexity. The R36 wasn't static. It evolved over time as manufacturers made small changes. Different mainboard revisions appeared, designated with names like r36s V12, r36s Y02, or cryptic identifiers like soy sauce for certain board types. These revisions might address earlier problems, incorporate different components based on availability, or make minor improvements to design or efficiency. However, they also meant that troubleshooting guides or modification instructions might not apply universally across all R36s units. The battery specification confusion exemplified these inconsistencies. Official specifications often listed a 3500 mAh battery, but units shipped with batteries ranging from 3,000 to 200 mAh. The actual model number varied, though most used standard 8466 lithium-ion cells with standard 2-pin JST connectors. This standardization meant replacement batteries could be sourced relatively easily, but the capacity variation meant different units might have noticeably different battery life even with identical usage patterns. Some manufacturers experimented with different color options. While translucent purple seemed to be an early popular color, units appeared in various hues: white, black, blue, red, and others. Some featured solid colors, others used translucent plastics that revealed internal components. These color choices were purely aesthetic, but added to the sense of diversity within the R36s product line. Users could select colors that matched their preferences, and the variety contributed to the device's appeal as something customizable and personal. The evolution towards special editions and variants created additional branches in the R36s family tree. Some sellers offered versions with upgraded storage, larger batteries, or bundled accessories. Others created themed variants with custom artwork or color schemes. These remained fundamentally R36s devices with the same core hardware, but they demonstrated how the open design allowed for experimentation and customization at the manufacturing level. The open-source nature that enabled this diversity also created a unique relationship between users and manufacturers. Unlike typical consumer electronics where manufacturers controlled the entire experience, R36s users often felt less like consumers and more like participants in a shared project. The devices were affordable enough that tinkering felt permissible. Breaking something while experimenting wasn't a disaster when replacements cost $50 rather than $500. This encouraged exploration, modification, and community knowledge sharing in ways that expensive proprietary devices couldn't support. Around the R36s, as around many open-source projects, a community emerged that became as important as the device itself. This community formed across multiple platforms: Reddit, particularly the r36s subreddit, Discord servers dedicated to retro handhelds, GitHub repositories hosting firmware and documentation, YouTube channels creating tutorials and reviews, and various forums and wikis aggregating knowledge. The r36s subreddit became a central gathering place. New users would arrive with their freshly delivered devices, sharing excitement and often immediately asking questions about firmware installation, game recommendations, or troubleshooting. Veterans would patiently answer, often linking to wiki pages or previous detailed explanations. This cycle of newcomers and helpful experienced users created a welcoming environment where knowledge was freely shared rather than hoarded. The community's willingness to help newcomers was notable, especially given how many questions were repetitive. What firmware should I use? Why is my screen black? Which games run best? These questions appeared constantly as new batches of R36s units shipped and fresh users joined the community. Yet rather than frustration, the community generally responded with patience and comprehensive guidance, understanding that everyone had been a confused newcomer at some point. Discord servers provided more immediate conversational support. Users could get real-time help working through problems, share screenshots of error messages or configuration screens, and engage in ongoing discussions about optimization, game discoveries, or hardware modifications. The live nature of Discord created stronger social bonds than forum posts, with users recognizing names and developing friendships around their shared interest in these devices. GitHub repositories served as the technical backbone of the community. The ArkOS R3XS repository maintained by ALSUX provided not just firmware releases, but detailed documentation about installation, configuration, and troubleshooting. Issue trackers allowed users to report bugs, request features, or seek help with specific problems. Pull requests enabled community members to contribute code improvements, documentation enhancements, or new features. This open development process made users feel invested in the software's evolution. The wiki pages hosted on platforms like handhelds.wiki became essential knowledge bases. These collaboratively edited documents covered every aspect of the r36s experience. Hardware identification guides helped users determine which screen panel their device had. Compatibility lists detailed which games ran well on which emulators with which settings. Troubleshooting guides addressed common problems with step-by-step solutions. Modification tutorials explained hardware upgrades or cosmetic changes. The collective knowledge accumulated in these wikis represented thousands of hours of community testing and documentation. YouTube creators played a crucial role in making the r36s accessible to less technical users. Video tutorials could show, rather than just describe, how to flash firmware to an SD card or configure emulation station. Reviews helped potential buyers understand what to expect before purchasing. Comparison videos placed the r36s alongside competing devices, helping users decide which handheld best fit their needs and budget. These creators often had no financial relationship with r36s manufacturers. They created content out of enthusiasm for the devices and the broader retro gaming hobby. Some YouTubers specialized in optimization guides, demonstrating how to squeeze better performance from the hardware through careful emulator configuration. Others focused on game recommendations, highlighting hidden gems or explaining which beloved classics ran particularly well on the device. Still others created content around modifications, showing how to upgrade components, customize appearances, or enhance functionality. This variety of content ensured users could find information matching their interests and technical comfort levels. The community developed shared language and conventions. Terms like panel picker, integer scaling, overclock, and shader became common vocabulary. Users learned to describe their issues with enough detail that others could provide targeted help. Which firmware version, which emulator core, which game, and what specific behavior was occurring. This shared technical language enabled efficient communication and faster problem-solving. Collaborative projects emerged from the community. Game compatibility lists, as mentioned earlier, were massive undertakings testing hundreds of titles. Theme collections brought together custom visual designs for emulation station. ROM hack collections highlighted modified versions of classic games with new levels, graphics, or gameplay. Save state shares allowed users to experience specific moments in games without playing through entire titles. These projects enriched the r36s ecosystem beyond what any individual could achieve alone. The community also celebrated successes and shared enthusiasm. Posts sharing game collections, themed builds, or personal gaming achievements received encouragement and appreciation. Users shared stories of introducing friends or family members to retro gaming through the r36s, or of rediscovering games they hadn't played in decades. This positive atmosphere contrasted with more toxic gaming communities, perhaps because the r36s community was united by shared interests rather than competitive dynamics. Modifications and hardware hacks became a significant community focus. Users documented processes for improving the r36 hardware, better quality SD cards for faster loading, higher capacity batteries for longer play, D-pad modifications for more precise input, or even screen upgrades when compatible better panels became available. These modifications range from simple and reversible to complex procedures, requiring soldering and careful disassembly. The community's documentation made even complex modifications accessible to users with patience and basic skills. One popular modification involved improving the D-pad feel through membrane or material swaps. Some users transplanted membranes from other controllers, finding combinations that provided crisper inputs or better diagonals. Others experimented with adding thin padding or adjusting the contact points between the D-pad and the underlying switches. These subtle changes could significantly improve the feel of 2D games, where precise control was essential. Battery upgrades offered longer play sessions. While the stock battery provided adequate life for most users, some wanted more. Community members identified compatible higher capacity batteries that would fit the R36s's battery compartment and work with its charging circuit. Careful documentation ensured others could replicate these upgrades safely without risking battery fires or damage to the device. Storage upgrades were perhaps the most common modification. Replacing the included microSD card with a high-quality, high-capacity card from a reputable manufacturer improved load times, reduced the chances of corruption, and provided space for larger game libraries. Community recommendations often pointed towards specific card brands and models known for reliability in handheld devices, helping users avoid cheap cards that might fail and lose entire game libraries. Some users took customization further with aesthetic modifications, custom paint jobs, vinyl skins, button replacements with different colors, and 3D printed accessories all appeared in community showcases. These modifications made devices unique and personal, expressions of individual style and creativity. The community appreciated these customizations without gatekeeping or demanding perfection, understanding that personal expression was part of the hobby's appeal. The knowledge sharing extended to software optimization. Users would discover that certain emulator cores performed better with specific settings, that particular games benefited from overclock profiles, or that certain shader combinations provided better visuals with acceptable performance impacts. These discoveries would be shared, tested by others, and incorporated into community knowledge bases. The collective experimentation yielded optimizations that improved experiences for everyone. Cultural knowledge was also shared within the community. Recommendations for overlooked games introduced users to titles they might never have discovered otherwise. Genre-specific recommendations helped users navigate the overwhelming libraries of classic systems. Historical context about games' original releases, development stories, or cultural significance enriched the experience beyond just gameplay. The community became not just technical support but also curators of gaming history. The community's resilience in facing challenges strengthened bonds. When firmware updates caused unexpected issues, users worked together to diagnose problems and develop solutions or rollback procedures. When particular game batches proved problematic, the community collaborated on identifying issues and finding workarounds. When confusion arose about hardware variants, users patiently helped others identify what they had and what it needed. These collaborative problem-solving experiences created shared history and mutual trust. Community events and challenges appeared organically. Some users organized Game of the Week discussions, where everyone would play the same title and share experiences. Others created challenge runs or speedrun competitions using the standardized hardware and software. These activities built community cohesion and provided structure and social context for what could otherwise be solitary gaming. The international nature of the community was noteworthy. The R36s was globally available through online marketplaces, and users from dozens of countries participated in forums and discussions. Language barriers were navigated with patience and translation tools. Regional differences in gaming nostalgia created interesting exchanges as users from different parts of the world shared their childhood favorites and discovered titles they'd never encountered. This cross-cultural exchange enriched everyone's understanding and appreciation of gaming history. As the R30CS matured and its community grew, tensions occasionally arose. Debates emerged about proper firmware choice, the ethics of ROM distribution, the legitimacy of various sellers, or the relative merits of competing devices. However, these disagreements rarely became acrimonious. The community generally maintained a culture of respectful disagreement and appreciation for diverse perspectives. The shared love of retro gaming and the R36s device provided common ground that prevented factional splits. The community's documentation and support effectively became the R36s's user manual. Game Console and other manufacturers provided minimal official documentation beyond basic operation. The community filled this gap comprehensively, creating resources far more detailed and helpful than most commercial device manuals. This community-created documentation became one of the R36s's greatest assets, transforming what could have been an impenetrable device for newcomers into something approachable with readily available guidance. The R36s's success and open-source nature inevitably led to what is often called the clone ecosystem, though clone might not be the most accurate term. These weren't simple copies trying to pass as the original. Instead, they were variations, iterations, and inspirations based on the same openly available hardware designs and approaches that made the R36s possible. Understanding this ecosystem requires recognizing that the R36s itself was part of a lineage. Game Console's earlier R35s had been based on Pokiddy's RGB20S design. The R36s evolved from that foundation while incorporating lessons learned and changes necessary to stand as its own design, so when other devices appeared sharing components or design language with the R36s, they were participating in the same open-source tradition, rather than engaging in simple copying. Several devices appeared that were clearly R36s-based or R36-inspired. The H36s took the R36 design and rotated it horizontally, creating a landscape-oriented device that some users preferred for certain game types. Other variants adjusted button layouts, tried different screen sizes within the same general form factor, or experimented with different plastic finishes and colours. These devices often used the same RK3326 processor and could run the same firmware, making them effectively R36s siblings rather than entirely different products. Some manufacturers with established reputations created their own takes on the vertical handheld concept. Anbernic, one of the larger names in retro handhelds, had devices like the RG354NINV that shared design DNA with the R36s approach, though predating it. The existence of multiple manufacturers exploring similar designs reflected market demand for affordable, portable retro gaming rather than anyone copying anyone else. The design language reflected shared understanding of what worked rather than intellectual property theft. The budget segment of the retro handheld market, which the R36s helped define and expand, began filling with options. Devices appeared at various price points from $30 to $100, each making different trade-offs in screen size, processor choice, build quality, or included features. This proliferation gave consumers more choices but also created decision paralysis for potential buyers trying to determine which device best suited their needs and preferences. The R36s maintained strong positions in this crowded market through several factors. Its community support was unmatched among budget devices. The extensive documentation, active forums, and regular firmware updates gave it longevity and reliability that newer or less supported devices couldn't match. For buyers nervous about purchasing a budget device from unfamiliar manufacturers, the r36s's established reputation and support network provided reassurance. The price-to-performance ratio remained competitive even as alternatives appeared. While some devices offered slightly better specifications or features, they typically came with noticeable price increases. The r36s stayed in that sweet spot where the cost felt nearly impulse purchase affordable, while the capabilities delivered genuine value. For buyers wanting to try retro handheld gaming without significant financial commitment, the r36s remained an obvious choice. The device's form factor continued appealing to a particular audience. Not everyone wanted the landscape orientation that dominated many competitors. The vertical design felt natural to Game Boy veterans and provided a distinctive aesthetic that some users strongly preferred. In a market where many devices looked increasingly similar, the r36s's verticality helped it stand out visually and functionally. The open-source ecosystem that enabled the r36s and its relatives created interesting dynamics in the market. Traditional consumer electronics markets rely on brand differentiation, patent protection, and proprietary technologies to create competitive advantages. The retro handheld market, particularly at the budget end, operated more like PC components, markets where standardized parts and open specifications created competition based on execution and service rather than exclusive technologies. This openness benefited consumers through lower prices and rapid innovation. Without patent restrictions or proprietary lock-in, manufacturers could quickly iterate on successful designs and incorporate community feedback. Features or improvements that worked well could spread across multiple device lines quickly. This collaborative competition, if such a phrase makes sense, accelerated improvements and kept prices low. However, the openness also created confusion. With multiple devices using similar names, specifications and designs, distinguishing between them required research. Buyers needed to understand not just what they were purchasing, but from whom. Understanding seller reputation and support quality mattered as much as hardware specifications. This complexity was manageable for enthusiasts, but potentially overwhelming for casual buyers. The r36s's influence extended beyond direct clones or variations. Its success demonstrated market demand for ultra-budget retro handhelds and encouraged manufacturers to explore this segment more seriously. Devices might not share the r36s design or specifications, but existed because the r36s proved the market was there. In this way, the r36s helped expand the entire retro handheld market, creating space for diversity and experimentation. The relationship between r36s users and competing device communities was generally friendly. Users in different device communities would share knowledge, as many principles of emulation optimization or firmware configuration applied across devices. Users often owned multiple handhelds, selecting different devices for different purposes or preferences. This multi-device ownership created cross-pollination of ideas and techniques between communities. Reviews and comparisons helped potential buyers navigate choices. Technology reviewers, often enthusiasts rather than professional journalists, would acquire multiple budget handhelds and compare them directly. These comparisons evaluated everything from build quality to performance, battery life to screen quality, helping buyers understand trade-offs and make informed decisions. The r36s generally performed well in these comparisons, particularly when factoring in price and community support. The clone ecosystem's existence validated the R36s's design choices. When other manufacturers looked at what game console had created and decided to make similar devices, they were effectively voting with their manufacturing capacity that the R36s had found something worth replicating. This validation came not from awards or official recognition, but from the hardest judgment, other companies choosing to compete in the space the R36s had defined. As 2024 progressed and moved into 2025, new competitors appeared with upgraded specifications. Devices using more powerful processors like the all-winner r36s or Rockchip RK3566 promised better performance, particularly for more demanding systems like N64, PSP, or Dreamcast. These devices positioned themselves as next steps for users who had been satisfied with their R36s, but wanted more capability. Rather than replacing the R36s, they expanded the market upward, creating a graduation path for users whose interest had been sparked by budget devices. The R36s Plus, announced in early 2025, represented game console's own attempt to iterate on their successful design. This upgrade featured the all-winner A133p processor for better performance and a 720 by 720 square screen with a 1.1 aspect ratio. The square screen was particularly interesting, as it could display Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and SNES games with minimal letterboxing while still handling the 4.3 systems the original R36s excelled with. This iteration showed that Game Console was listening to community feedback and market trends while maintaining the affordability and openness that defined the original R36s. As we approach the end of our journey through the R36s story, it's worth reflecting on what this device represents beyond just its technical specifications and gaming capabilities. The R36s became significant not because it was the most powerful handheld or the most innovative design, but because it democratized access to retro gaming in ways few devices before it had achieved. Gaming has always been to some degree expensive. Even retro gaming, which might seem inexpensive since the games are old, carried costs. Collecting original hardware meant searching for increasingly scarce consoles and dealing with aging components that failed. Building emulation setups required knowledge, compatible hardware, and often significant troubleshooting. Premium retro handhelds from established brands offered convenience, but demanded prices that made them considered purchases rather than impulse acquisitions. The R36s arrived at a price point where trying retro handheld gaming became nearly risk-free. $50 to $60, often less during sales or with coupons, was affordable enough that a disappointing purchase wouldn't cause significant financial pain. This low barrier to entry invited experimentation. People who might never have considered purchasing a dedicated retro gaming device suddenly had one on the way from AliExpress. This accessibility mattered enormously for expanding the retro gaming community. Many R36s users reported that the device rekindled their love of gaming, or introduced them to classics they'd missed. The convenience of having thousands of games in a pocket-sized device, combined with the modern conveniences of save states and visual enhancements, made retro gaming more appealing than the hassles of original hardware. Games that had been forgotten in childhood were rediscovered. Titles that had only been heard about but never played became accessible. Entire console libraries that had been regional exclusives opened up through emulation and fan translations. The R36s also served as an educational device in multiple ways. For younger gamers who'd grown up with modern 3D graphics and complex mechanics, the R36s provided history lessons in interactive form. Playing Super Mario Bros. Or The Legend of Zelda wasn't just entertainment. It was understanding the foundations that modern gaming was built upon. experiencing the evolution from 8-bit to 16-bit to early 3D graphics in chronological order, revealed how game design had developed and what remained timeless versus what was artifact of technical limitations. For parents and older gamers, the r36s became a bridge between generations, sharing childhood favourites with children or younger friends, watching them experience games that had shaped earlier generations' gaming memories, created moments of connection and shared understanding. The games themselves became conversation starters about how gaming and technology had changed, how different constraints shaped different creative solutions, and how nostalgia coloured memories of these experiences. The device's open-source nature taught users about technology in ways proprietary devices rarely could. Installing custom firmware required understanding file systems, directory structures, and how operating systems loaded. Troubleshooting problems developed problem-solving skills and patience. Optimizing emulators taught concepts like processor utilization, graphics rendering, and system resources. These weren't formal educational experiences, but they were learning nonetheless. Practical skills gained through hands-on engagement with technology. The community that formed around the r36s demonstrated positive aspects of internet culture. In an era where online discourse often became toxic or adversarial, the r36s community maintained largely positive, helpful interactions. This wasn't accidental. The shared interest in preserving and enjoying gaming history, combined with the collaborative nature of open-source projects, created a culture of mutual support. Users understood they were part of something larger than individual purchases. They were participants in a community project to make retro gaming accessible and enjoyable. The r36s story also highlighted tensions in intellectual property and game preservation. The device existed in legal grey areas. Emulation itself was legal. The hardware and software to run emulators were legitimate. However, the ROM files, the actual game data, existed in murkier territory. Owning a game cartridge arguably gave you rights to back up that data, but downloading ROM files from internet sources was legally questionable even if widely practiced. The r36s, shipping with thousands of preloaded games, navigated these issues pragmatically rather than strictly legally. This raised important questions about game preservation. Many classic games were no longer commercially available. The original hardware was aging and failing. Copyright holders often showed little interest in maintaining access to older titles, allowing them to fade into obscurity. Emulation and devices like the r36s served de facto preservation roles, keeping these games playable when official channels failed to do so. While legally complex, the cultural and historical value of this preservation work seemed undeniable. The r36s demonstrated that successful products didn't need massive marketing budgets or corporate backing. Its success came through word of mouth, community enthusiasm, and genuine value delivered. This grassroots success story contrasted with traditional consumer electronics that relied on advertising, retail presence, and brand recognition. The r36s proved that in the age of online marketplaces and social media, a good product with engaged users could find its audience without traditional promotional infrastructure. The device's popularity also reflected broader trends in gaming culture. Retro gaming had moved from niche hobby to mainstream interest. Game development had become so expensive and risk-averse that innovation often came from independent developers and retro-inspired projects. Many modern gamers found that older games, with their focus on immediate playability and tight design, provided more satisfaction than bloated modern titles with endless content padding and monetization schemes. The R36s tapped into this sentiment, offering pure gaming experiences without modern complications. Nostalgia, of course, played a significant role in the R36s's appeal. For millennials and Gen X gamers, these were the games of childhood and adolescence. Playing them decades later evoked powerful memories of simpler times, of afternoons without responsibilities, of the excitement of getting a new game, of the social experiences around gaming in an era before online multiplayer. The R36s became a delivery mechanism for these emotional experiences as much as it was a gaming device. But the appeal extended beyond pure nostalgia. Younger players discovering these games for the first time often found them genuinely engaging despite dated graphics. Good game design transcended visual fidelity. Tight controls, clever level design, satisfying progression systems, memorable characters, and compelling gameplay loops remained engaging regardless of pixel count. The R36s gave these timeless design principles access to new audiences who could appreciate them on their own merits. The device's physical form factor connected to handheld gaming history in meaningful ways. Holding the R36s evoked tactile memories of Game Boys held on long car trips, of PSPs played during school commutes, of quiet evenings curled up with a handheld rather than in front of a television. The verticality specifically recalled the original Game Boy's design, that iconic shape that defined portable gaming for a generation. This physical continuity mattered, creating an emotional resonance that purely technical devices couldn't achieve. As the R36s matured through 2024 and into 2025, it faced the inevitable question all technology faces: how long would it remain relevant? More powerful competitors appeared. Newer devices offered better screens, faster processors, more features. Yet the R36s maintained its position through the factors we've discussed: community support, excellent documentation, proven reliability, and an established ecosystem. For many users, these advantages outweighed the appeal of newer hardware. The device also benefited from good enough, being genuinely sufficient for its intended purpose. If the goal was playing games from the 8-bit, 16-bit, and early 3D eras, the R36s accomplished that excellently. More power wasn't necessary for better Super Nintendo emulation. It was already perfect. Faster processors didn't improve Game Boy Advance playback. It was already flawless. The R36s hit a performance plateau where the systems it handled well represented a complete, satisfying gaming library encompassing thousands of classics. For games beyond its capabilities, users accepted the limitations and focused on what worked, rather than lamenting what didn't. This contentment with enough, rather than constant pursuit of more, felt almost countercultural in modern tech culture. The R36s taught appreciation for what was rather than longing for what might be. This mindset extended to the device itself. Users didn't constantly wish for premium build quality or flagship features, but appreciated what the device delivered within its constraints. The modifications and customization culture that developed around the R36s reflected a broader maker movement philosophy. Rather than passive consumption of products exactly as manufactured, users engaged actively with their devices, swapping components, installing custom firmware, adjusting configurations, even aesthetic modifications, all represented taking ownership and control. This active engagement created deeper satisfaction and connection than passive use ever could. Looking forward, the R36s seemed likely to maintain presence and relevance even as newer devices appeared. Its established community would continue supporting it. The firmware would receive updates. New users would continue discovering it as an affordable entry point. The device had reached a critical mass where it became self-sustaining, generating enough interest and support that it would persist beyond what typical consumer electronics lifespans might predict. The R36s story is ultimately about accessibility, community, and the enduring appeal of well-designed games. It showed that high-quality retro gaming experiences didn't require expensive hardware or elaborate setups. It demonstrated that online communities could be positive, helpful spaces focused on shared interests rather than conflict. It proved that decades-old games remained engaging when made accessible through modern convenience, and it suggested that open-source approaches to consumer electronics could succeed, creating value through collaboration rather than corporate control. For the individuals whose gaming lives were touched by the R36s, whether as first retro handheld or latest in a collection, the device held personal significance beyond its objective capabilities. It was the device that rekindled gaming passion, the companion on commutes, the bridge to childhood memories, the tool for sharing gaming history with the next generation. The proof that budget devices could deliver premium experiences. Each R36s carried individual stories and meanings that statistics and specifications could never capture. As our journey through the R36s story draws to a close, let your mind settle on what we've discovered together. We've travelled from the device's humble origins in late 2023, through its technical architecture, across its software ecosystem, into the community that embraced it, and finally to its cultural significance. Along the way, we've seen how a simple budget handheld became something more, how it represented ideas and values beyond just playing old games. The R36 reminds us that technology serves human needs and desires, the need for affordable entertainment, the desire to reconnect with fond memories, the joy of discovery and exploration, the satisfaction of understanding and mastering systems, the pleasure of sharing experiences with others. All of these needs the R36s addressed not through being the most powerful or expensive device, but through being accessible, functional, and supported by people who cared. As you lie here tonight, perhaps you're thinking about games you once loved and might explore again. Maybe you're considering whether the R36C or a similar device might fit into your life. Or perhaps you're simply appreciating how technology stories can be about communities and culture as much as circuits and code. Whatever thoughts drift through your mind, let them come gently, without forcing or grasping. The R36 will continue its quiet journey, carried in pockets and bags around the world, lighting up with familiar title screens, bringing moments of joy to whoever holds it. Some devices become icons through flashy launches and massive marketing. Others, like the R36s, become beloved through proving their worth one user at a time, building reputation through consistent service rather than promised features. In the broader story of gaming and technology, the R36s occupies a modest but meaningful chapter. It's not the most important device, nor the most revolutionary, but it mattered to the people who used it, and it contributed to keeping gaming history accessible and alive. That contribution, quiet and unpretentious as it was, carries real value. Every person who discovered a beloved game through an R36s, every community member who helped a confused newcomer, every moment of joy provided by the device, these accumulate into something worthwhile. As you drift towards sleep, you might imagine the R36s's soft screen glow in a darkened room, the familiar sounds of classic games playing gently, the comfortable weight of it resting in relaxed hands. Or perhaps you envision the countless moments worldwide where R36s devices are being pulled from pockets, games are being loaded, and brief escapes into pixel art worlds are beginning. each instance a tiny victory for accessibility and preservation, the story of the R36s isn't finished. Devices continue shipping, communities keep growing, new users keep discovering it, firmware keeps improving, games keep being played. But our telling of this story reaches its gentle conclusion here, in this quiet evening, as your breathing steadies and deepens, as thoughts become dreamlike and soft, as consciousness drifts peacefully toward rest. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of the R36. I hope you found it interesting, informative, and most importantly, calming. If you enjoyed this exploration, remember to like and subscribe, or share your thoughts in the comments. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, just rest. Let everything we've discussed settle into comfortable memory. Let the details blur into gentle impressions. The R36s, with its modest origins and meaningful impact, can wait. The games can wait. Everything can wait. There's nothing you need to do. Nothing you need to remember. Nothing requiring your attention. Just breathing. Just settling. Just releasing into rest. The night is quiet around you. Your body is comfortable and supported. Your mind is peaceful and clear. And somewhere, an R36s screen glows softly with a familiar game, waiting patiently for whenever you're ready to return. But not now. Now is for sleep, for rest, for letting go completely. Good night. Word count. Summary. Part 1, 5,000 words. Part 2, 5,000 words. Part 3, 5,000 words. Finale. 12,100 words. Total, 17,100 words.